Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program, we're going to learn something that I think a lot of us really need to instill as we face a lot of uncertainty in the upcoming presidential election, and that is the fear of having sovereignty and being able to think for yourself. After all, I know many of you out there know how to quote the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the idea that we can gather and protest and maybe even turn those protests into something a lot more violent. But just saying that you are sovereign, you got to be more than that. You have to be seriously and passionate about knowing that you are sovereign and unapologetically demanding that the rest of the world accept you as such. Well, today we're going to be addressing some of those fears and misconceptions that you may hold by declaring your independence and the integrity, intelligence, and bravery that you need to break the shackles of government slavery and start living a life of freedom and liberty. Our guest certainly faced his fear by jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. He also done something such as running for President of the United States and won the Libertarian Party's nomination back in 2004. Our guest is back on the program today to talk about his newest book and to share with us the insights of what it means to be the sovereign individual. His book is Secret to Sovereignty, or How to Survive the Second American Revolution. Michael Badnarik, thank you for being back on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for calling me back. You guys had...
Yeah, sometimes things happen, but there's nothing better than trying to get something happening, again, where people can go, wow, I'm really glad I spent time listening to those two to move forward, especially in these uncertain times. What got you started on this path?
Several years ago, I worked for a company. They sent me to Pittsburgh to work on this project, and while I was there, I had an unpleasant encounter with the IRS. I don't know if there were any pleasant encounters. And the long story short, I started to study the 16th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and quickly came to the conclusion that most of what our government does is unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And that's not a euphemism. I didn't believe my own research at first. Eventually, someone handed me a book called Creature from Jekyll Island, and when I read the book, I realized I was wrong. The problem was much worse than I had imagined. And so I have been trying to educate people into the proper flow of political power, and it is just the opposite of what we all take for granted today.
Mm-hmm. That's always a good place to start for a lot of people is the Internal Revenue Service, because whenever you say that, that kind of is up there with saying or screaming shark.
Yes.
It really is, and it's really amazing. And I like that you made the reference to Creature from Jekyll Island. We actually had him as a guest on our program to talk about that very book, and you become astonished in thinking about how something, even with its title, seems to mean one thing to you when it's actually the very opposite, and that is the Federal Reserve. You think this is a government body. And you also think the government is supposed to at least have the post to protect us. But a lot of those things just simply aren't true, and I think that a lot of people this year have come to know that now.
They are starting to wake up, although it's a little bit late, I think. But I've been teaching a 8-hour class on the Constitution and Bill of Rights for over 20 years, and I started teaching this class because people would come up and say, well, Social Security is in the Constitution. No, it's not.
No, that was in the FDR. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I would hand them a copy of the Constitution, and I said, show me where that is in the Constitution. And so when I begin my class, I say, most of what you think you know about the government and about the Constitution is wrong. And so frequently I'll give a presentation and ask people to raise their hand if they're good, patriotic Americans. Everybody raises their hand. It's unanimous. Then I'll say, raise your hand if you can tell me how many articles are in the Constitution. Nobody raises it. You don't even know how many articles there are? So hypothetically, if the government was doing something unconstitutional, how would you know? And the answer is you wouldn't, because you've never read it. And most of what the government is doing is unconstitutional because you're letting them get away with it. And it's a shock. It's kind of the as in A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth. Well, when I start teaching people about the Constitution, they're shocked. First of all, they're in disbelief, but the logic that I use makes it inevitable. You can't argue with it, and people really are. I've had grown men crying at the end of my class when they realize just how corrupt our government is.
Especially when they come to realize when Donald Trump was running for office back in 2016, I'm here to clean the swamp, and then he realizes, boy, this isn't just deep, it's wide too. Wow. Yeah. I like when you brought up the idea of how many articles are in the Constitution, because you find yourself at times with encounters with law enforcement. And, if there's ever been a time that you can sense and know an erosion of your rights, it's when you have encounters with police. And I did come across something, and this was some time ago, where apparently there was this, he had been, I guess, an officer or county sheriff for quite many years, and he was actually in a law class. And what he said is simply, when you get pulled over, you don't talk to the police. The only time that ever needs to happen is perhaps saying, are you citing me or are you detaining me? And then that way you know whether or not you need to get a lawyer involved, but just keep your mouth shut, because anything you say will be held against you in a court of law, and that even includes an up to before they Mirandize you. But what has your encounters been like and how that plays out? Because it's pretty interesting when people listen to this, they realize, how come I'm so compliant when I end up getting myself screwed just being polite?
Well, see, they're trying to be polite, and they think that being cooperative with the police is going to make the outcome a little bit better. But the truth is that the police may have pulled you over on some suspicion, but they don't have enough evidence. But when you start rattling, giving them all this information, you 80% of the time you give them information that now makes you guilty, and you weren't guilty when they stopped you. What I like to do when the police officer comes to the window, I like to say, you appear to be a police officer. Well, that puts them on, that throws them for a loop, because they're wearing the uniform, they got the badge, usually they got this big gun in their hip. I mean, how could you not know that they were a police officer? And I ask them, did you take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution? And frequently they'll say, well, the Texas Constitution. And I said, well, so then I can have you arrested for impersonating an officer, because Article 6 of the federal Constitution requires everybody at the legislative, executive, and judicial branches to take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. And they go, well, yeah, I suppose it was in there someplace. And I go, well, good. If you've taken an oath to protect it, then you can tell me how many articles are in the Constitution. And they can't, at which point I accuse them of just having a photo op, that their oath didn't really mean anything. And then I say that if you have violated the Constitution, it is potentially perjury, where you lied under oath, or if you've consciously violated the Constitution, it's treason, which is punishable by life imprisonment or health. And suddenly, my speeding ticket doesn't seem to be quite so important anymore. And in most of my conversations on the side of the road, they've gone, have a nice day, travel safely, we'll talk to you later.
Wow.
That's not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
I have been thrown in jail, and there are one or two times I went, oh my gosh, I have really pushed the envelope too far this time. I was in jail, and In a few short minutes, I was teaching my Constitution class to a captive audience.
I can believe that. Having been to jail myself, they're captive enough because there ain't a whole lot going on there.
Yeah.
But that brings up a very important point, and that is the idea, well, people think, well, that they're afraid to go to jail, and so an easy question, well, have you? It's the same thing as have you been fired from a job? And I have, and I know this is true, is it can become the most liberating thing that can happen to you in your life because you realize that's the worst thing a company, to a degree, can possibly do for you. And you start feeling kind of confident after that, like, well, okay, let me reevaluate the situation that I was in. Let's take a look at where I can learn from this experience, where I can elevate that knowledge to apply it in the next, situation. And that's certainly something that you've done, is that you have faced these things and you've grown from them. So as though it may seem easy for a lot of listeners out there who may be pulled over by law enforcement to parrot what you just said, it's a much different circumstance when law enforcement can smell and see that you're kind of intimidated, and that's exactly what they start doing. But that's part of the growing curve. But you have to grow and you have to have the experience. And the most important thing is you have to have the knowledge and know when and how to apply it. That's exactly what you talk about in your book, The Sovereign Individual.
Yeah. The thing that people are going to have to eliminate from their lives as much as possible is fear. Thomas Jefferson said, when people fear the government, there is tyranny, and when the government fears the people, there is liberty. So when the police officer comes to your window, it's scary. I've had my knees knocking before. It's easy to report these things after the fact on the radio and act like I was all brave. But, at the moment, it's like it could go any way. Just because I'm a smart mouth, they can pull a gun and put me in a hospital. So you have to know just how far you're willing to push the envelope. But you have to eliminate the fear. If you live in fear, then you're never going to be sovereign. You're never going to be in charge. If I walk into the room and I clench my fist and I say, get down on all fours and bark like a dog, if you do, it doesn't really matter what I've asked you to do, except that it's nonsense. And the only thing I have learned is that you are willing to be submissive. You're afraid of me, and now if you're willing to bark like a dog, I can make you do just about anything. And I think that the coronavirus is mostly a test of the American population. The government says, coronavirus, sky is falling, everybody stay home and destroy the economy. And we did. There's very little outrage. Nobody going, hell with you, I'm not staying home. And so there was almost no pushback to the government demonstrating that the American public is mostly submissive. They will do whatever the government tells them to do.
And you also bring up the point, too, and I hear this a lot, especially this day and age, is that Americans in general, although it may sound like a very harsh word, are stupid. And the fact is that you hear people actually verbate opinion, and usually that opinion comes from probably a news source or from someone else. And it's pretty astonishing when you ask an individual when they have an opinion about whatever may be going on is, what evidence do you have that what you're saying is true? And you could just see them kind of crumble and fumble, like they already know that they don't have anything hard. It was something they heard. And it's a lot like these people in the coronavirus when you might go somewhere, and I've had, encounters just like this. You're not wearing your mask, or your mask isn't up over your nose. And I'm like, what you don't want to do is confront me the way you are, with a lack of courtesy and respect, because you won't be wearing a mask for too much longer, sort of a thing. But you see this all of a sudden, these meek, weak, stupid-ass people, I'm sorry, are out there thinking they're the mask police. Where were you before all this? Where's that courage going in the direction that it should be going, not against me?
Right. And what the problem is, these people are afraid of the government, and you pose less of a fear. They're afraid that everybody's going to die because you're not wearing a mask, and so they've been psychologically pushed into a corner. But there's this hypothetical story. You have half a dozen monkeys in a cage. There's a ladder in the middle of the cage, and just above the ladder is a bunch of bananas. And so the short story is they try to climb the ladder to get the bananas, and the entire group is hosed down with cold water. Well, one by one, you replace the monkeys, and now you have 6 brand new monkeys. Nobody has ever tasted a banana. Nobody has ever climbed the ladder. But you put a new monkey in, and as the new monkey is totally unaware of what's been going on beforehand, tries to climb the ladder, the other monkeys will beat the snot out of it because they don't want to be hosed down with water. And so it becomes a thing. Nobody's allowed to climb the ladder to get the bananas. We don't even know why, except for the fact that, somewhere along the line, that's what the community has been trained to do. And slowly but surely, the American population has been trained to be submissive to government. When you're 5 years old, you have to listen to mom and dad. Eat your vegetables, go to bed by 8. When you go to school, you got to turn in your homework. You get your permit, you got to listen to the police officer. You get a job after college, you have to listen to your manager, get your timesheets and reports in by Friday afternoon, and then you got to get down on one knee and beg for a vacation. At every stage of our lives, we are looking for permission from somebody that we assume is a higher authority. When are you going to grow up? When are you going to make your own decisions? Isn't that what growing up is all about? And so we have been conditioned to look to some authority. We are afraid to make our own decisions because, oh my gosh, I could be wrong. Well, I know my rights. Nobody tells me what to do, which was really a problem for my parents, except that I was a good kid. I was a Boy Scout for 12 years, an advanced first aid instructor for the Red Cross. I was a good kid, but I still did things my way. And, mom and dad could make recommendations, and I'd go, nah, I don't think so. Well, scuba diving, for example, I loved going underwater. Jacques Cousteau was my hero at the time, and my mother was terrified. Now, to her credit, she never stopped me from going scuba diving, but she really didn't want me to. And, I went, look, this is what I'm going to do with my life, and you don't get to choose.
And then you went on and faced your fear through skydiving.
I did. I used to tell people I'm not afraid of anything, which was only partially true. I wasn't afraid of anything except falling. And fear is a symptom of ignorance. If you don't know how to swim, you'll probably be afraid of the water because you don't think you can control the environment. Once you learn how to swim, the pool and the ocean are just fun places to go with your friends. So using that equation, if I'm afraid of falling, I need to learn something about it. Well, what's the best way to learn about falling? Well, let's go to the airport and jump out of an airplane. I was only going to do this once because I had to prove to myself that even if there was fear, my logical brain would, snap into and take care of me. And it worked so well that I went to the airport 50 out of 52 weekends the first year.
Wow, and it's pretty incredible that once you have that experience that it never is what you thought it was. And I mean that in the sense that there's a way that we think something's going to be or turn out. And in a lot of cases, people have fear in the way that clouds them from making the choice to make that decision and step forward. And as you just said, a lot of that's just based on ignorance. What you don't know, you don't know. And so the best way to test that is to find out, let's say you have a fear, and you mentioned the Internal Revenue Service, and I actually had an encounter with them many years ago. And there's nothing worse than when you get a notice saying, hey, by the way, you owe us money, and of course, they may put a lien on your property. They may freeze your bank accounts, and all these things they may do is what this notice says if you don't pay this bill that you owe us. And I think it was around $5,000. And that was a lot of money at that particular time. It's a lot of money anyway. But here's the thing. I just finally decided, well, I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call the Internal Revenue Service. I'm going to see how we're going to work this out. And what I felt inside me was overwhelming as far as fear goes. I mean, what do I know about the IRS code? Like a lot of people, what do you really know about their procedures? All you know is the stories that you heard, much like these monkeys in the cage. You know, one's reaching for the banana and the rest get sprayed down with water. And so as I'm sitting there, I'm just feeling this fear. And the lady gets on the phone, and I said, you know, I'm calling about this particular tax bill. I don't have any big excuses for you, but what I want to know is what can we do right now to work this out? She says, hold on a minute. She gets back on the phone about 2 minutes later, and she says, you know what? We're going to go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and waive the bill off. And I was like, what does that mean? She says, you don't have to pay it. I'm going to go ahead and send you a letter that confirms about this conversation today. You're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And the relief, I actually had a tear in my eye. I couldn't believe it. That hear all this story you hear about the IRS, but I just decided to confront it, then face it and say, what can we do? And that's how it worked out. And I was just like, oh my goodness. But it's amazing when you test that fear, much as like you did out in the field with law enforcement, or much like you did when it was time to run for president. I mean, let's talk about some of these big fears that perhaps you had where it just took knowing something that changed everything and said, now that I know this, how am I going to go out and test it and learn from it and grow?
Well, if we're talking about the IRS, let's take a little bit bigger picture. Most people fill out their 1040 form not because they're all excited about the government, but because they're afraid to go to jail. I don't want to be on the government's bad side. But, if you say, why does the government collect all this money in April? You go, well, to build roads and hospitals and improve the environment. Well, that is not true. When Reagan was president, he commissioned a report. It's the Grace Report, which concluded that the money collected on April 15th goes to pay the interest on the debt, not the debt. So it's like a little bit like getting a credit card statement. You owe $3,000 and you got a $200 minimum payment and you're paying $150. Well, you're never going to get it paid off because you're paying less than the minimum payment. But the Federal Reserve, everybody assumes the Federal Reserve is, a government agency, and it's not. But the Federal Reserve prints money out of thin air. Well, if the government can print money out of thin air, why do they have to collect your money? Why don't they just print more? Them are already printing, counterfeiting our currency, have been since 1913. But why do they have to collect your money if they can print it? And the answer is the government doesn't need your money. They really don't care. What they want is your compliance. Filling out a 1040 form is the exact equivalent of get down on all fours and bark like a dog. And because you do, you are demonstrating to them that you are submissive, the government is in charge, and you are not willing to stand up for your rights. So, the IRS admits that there are, some 40 million people in the United States who do not fill out a 1040 form that the IRS thinks they should. And so it's all about understanding where this stuff is going from. It doesn't make any logical sense. And so, Federal Express is not a part of the government. It's got the word federal in its name. So the Federal Reserve sounds like it could be part of the government, but it's not. And I recommend that your readers your listeners go out and read Creature from Jekyll Island. It's easy for me to make these statements in a couple seconds on the radio, but you really need to go out and read that book to get the understanding and the education to lose your fear of the IRS in particular and the American government in general.
You know, and it's so true because they tend to, one secret weapon, if you want to call it secret, is ideology. You know, the idea that they're out there as looking out for your best interest and safety. And it's really funny how you begin, for instance, one of your chapters about that. And you have a quote from Winston Churchill: "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." And it's funny how these things are actually sold to us. For instance, Bernie Sanders out there flapping his gums about how, well, you know, if you elect me president, I'll probably abolish everybody's student loans. Well, what student out there doesn't want to feel the relief of that? But there's a catch. There's got to be a catch. Now let's go ahead and talk about how sometimes ideology is sold to us and how you need to take that as an opportunity to say, what do I need to learn here about how I'm being captured, and move forward so I can be sure that I maintain, A, my sanity as well as my sovereignty?
Well, most of what we are told is a lie. And the school systems were controlled by the government since 1953. They are no longer, it's no longer an education system, it's an indoctrination system where they want you to be compliant. They want you to be just smart enough to work in an assembly line and produce stuff, but they don't want you to be smart enough to be able to defend yourself. And so you have to understand why the Constitution was written. There's a one-word answer for every question about the Constitution, and that is property. The whole purpose of this is private property. Without private property, you have no rights. All right? When you look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, plank number 1 is to abolish private property. Well, if all of your rights derive from property and the communists are going to eliminate property, then it's not a real difficult logic to realize you have no rights. So the Constitution and communism are antithetical. They are opposite extremes, true and false. And most of us don't recognize what communism really is. I mean, you know, why is communism bad? Because they have a red flag? Because the soldiers march funny? No, because the government takes control of all of the property and you have nothing. You have nothing. And so why did many of your listeners are not even old enough to remember the USSR? That was, you know, Russia. Well, over the last 2 decades, USSR has dissolved into about 20 different independent countries. You know, they all quit. It said, we're not going to play that game anymore. And it's basically economic. When you have communism, the government controls your wealth. And they used to say, the government, we pretend to work and the government pretends to pay us. And yeah, everybody is equal under communism at the poverty level.
Now, would you agree that to some level in the United States, Marxism is practiced? Certainly communism is there. I mean, you can see evidence of that when you bring up property and property ownership. For instance, well, look, you know, if I buy and I actually pay off my home, then the bank no longer owns it because there's no mortgage. So now I don't have to pay anybody. And so then it comes down to, well, try not paying your property taxes and see what happens. But again, the threat is there, and it does exist, but it's up to you to say, well, if it's true that if I don't pay my property taxes, my home can be just simply taken away from me. In fact, there was a recent example of that where a gentleman, I guess, owed something like $8 on his home and just didn't pay it for property taxes. And they decided to take his home from him and sell it on the chopping block. Well, That was an education opportunity moment right there. In fact, it should have been as soon as you decide to buy a home or own property, what rights do I have in property ownership? And let's talk about that in the scope of the Constitution.
Well, most people do not own property the way they think that they do. You know, as you said, you pay off the mortgage on the home and you think, okay, I own my home free and clear. Well, if you're paying property taxes, you don't own it free and clear. And in my book, my first book, Good to Be King, I talk about allodial title. Most people would know that as mineral rights. If you don't have the mineral rights, then you really don't own your property. If I own my property, I can go out in the backyard, set up an oil well, and start digging for oil. You try that in your backyard, and the sheriff is going to be there within a couple hours going, "You're in a heap of trouble, boy. You can't do that." It's like, really? I thought I owned this property. And what's even more confusing to most people, they think they own their body, and they don't. I was talking to your producer last night, and I explained that we, the people, create the Constitution. When we did that, we invented Congress. The government works for us. And then over the course of time, Congress invented a legal status called United States citizen, and this is all into the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens of the United States and citizens of the state wherein they reside. So first of all, it's dual citizenship, but because Congress invented this legal corporate status, then Congress has more power than a United States citizen. And so the result, which is, it makes you feel like you're in Alice's Wonderland, if you are a United States citizen, you have no rights. You only have privileges which are granted to you by the government. Whereas if you are a citizen of the state, aka we the people have a right to travel. We can exercise our right to travel. If you're a United States citizen, you have to have a driver's license. If you are we the people, you have a right to life. You have a right to protect that life by carrying a gun. If you are a United States citizen, you don't have rights. You have to have privileges, and you have to apply for a concealed carry permit. And so I'll ask people, do you have a church permit? And they go, well, no, freedom of religion is a right. And I go, correct. How is the First Amendment different than the Second Amendment? It's not. So if you do not require a church permit, then I do not require a concealed carry permit. And everybody is astonished when they try to process that information. It's really fun to watch a police officer do that. I mean, they are standing there, there's practically smoke coming out of their ears, and it's like 2 + 2 is not equal to 5. What's wrong with this picture?
As you bring up the citizenry of the United States, it brings up another wonderful way of looking at this too, and that is the idea of the birth certificate. Now, many years ago, there was a young man who considered himself patriotic, and he was sharing some information that I thought was pretty unique. And as I began to look into it more and more, I thought, he isn't just hearing this from somewhere, hearsay, and sharing it because it's exciting news. He actually studies this stuff. And the idea of the birth certificate is that when you were born, they actually put your name on there sort of like in capital letters, and then your parents basically sign you away. And you're signed into what's called maritime law, so basically you become nothing but cargo. And because you're not a real life, you're basically a fictional character now. You don't have rights because your parents have signed them away. It's a death certificate as much as it's supposed to be a birth certificate. What are your thoughts on that?
I have studied that, and I believe it to be true. I think that trying to get people to understand what their rights are, it kind of goes off the reservation a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not true, but I don't think that it will help anybody directly when they are being oppressed by the government. I have created a brand new PowerPoint presentation called How to Form a Civil Society. A close friend of mine wanted me to teach his 16-year-old girls about the Constitution. And I thought, my original presentation was just a little bit over their head. I wanted to simplify it and bring it down so that 16-year-old can understand. And I start with a Latin quote which translates into the power which is derived cannot be greater than the power from which it is derived. So if I screw a hook into the ceiling and tie a rope to the hook, I can climb up to the ceiling, but I can't climb higher than the ceiling because the ceiling is what allows me to climb. If I have a dozen eggs, I can give you 1, 2, maybe even a dozen eggs, but I can't give you 13 eggs because I never had 13 eggs. I can't give you what I don't have myself. But the ultimate thing is that the creator always has more power than the created. We, the people, created the government. You and I do not require government permission to exist. However, the government does require our permission to exist. And if that sounds a little bit radical, I point you to the Declaration of Independence, which says that when any form of government becomes destructive of our rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. What does abolish mean to you? It means that we, the people, built this government, and if we don't like the way it's working, we can scrap it and we can start again. And if that doesn't give you a sense of authority, I don't know what will. You've got to get rid of your fear. You have to stop believing that the police officer who comes to your window is the authority and you have to be submissive. Sovereignty is a state of mind. You have to stop being submissive. You have to be like Steven Seagal walking into a biker bar. Okay, you and I might not go into a biker bar because, well, that just looks like it could be a little bit dangerous. But if you're Steven Seagal, you can go into any bar you want knowing that if there is a fight, you're not going to be the one that gets all beat up. You have the authority, but you have to know that, and you have to believe it. And that's what this whole sovereignty thing is.
And I can say unequivocally from experience that although they look pretty rough and tumble, they're actually pretty nice guys, as I've bartended in biker bars. And boy, they like to have a good time and they're rowdy, but I'll tell you what, you won't get your butt whipped unless you have it coming to you. But if you get your butt whipped by a biker, it's because you deserved it.
I agree. I agree completely. I have had so many friends who were bikers, but it's that stereotype.
Right.
We have stereotypes where Irishmen are always drunk and, motorcycle people are always violent bank robbers and, black people are always drug dealers. None of that makes any sense. You can't paint everybody with a wide brush.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you need to evaluate each and every person. There are good and bad people who are white, good and bad people who are black, good and bad people who are Irish. They're just good and bad people, and it's your job to filter them down, not based on the color of their skin or where they're from, but whether or not they are good or bad.
Right. And here's another one I wanted to bring up, although we briefly talked about the idea of the birth certificate. Here's the other one that you mentioned earlier, and that's the driver's license. Now, there was an acquaintance I had up in Portland, Oregon. It's become world famous now on the stage for their rioting techniques, but certainly I left long before that. But he was actually very contentious against the Department of Motor Vehicles about licensing, saying, did you know that you don't have to have a driver's license to drive a car? And I was kind of astonished by that, like, really? And he says, not only that, but if you don't have this license, then you don't really have to abide by the regulations set forth about travel. And you were mentioning the right to travel earlier. And I wanted to bring this up. He says, no, the reason you have to carry a driver's license is only if you're driving commercially. In other words, to earn money. For instance, in trucking, perhaps a cab driver, things like that. But other than that, if you're just privately going from point A to point B, there is no reason for you to have a license. And I know there would be a lot of people that would argue that fact. Well, if I get pulled over without a license, I'll get fined. I might lose my license. Well, that's the whole idea behind it. Or you're driving now because they've suspended your license. You're going to get fined for that. And then he says, but don't you see the pattern there? They're fining you. In other words, they're basically chafing money out of you through fines. And that's really what the police force seems to have become, at least when it comes to traffic stops and the like.
And I have a document that I'm willing to email to. If your listeners are paying attention, they can send me an email at michael@badnarik.org and request travel citations. And I have a document about 5-6 pages long, which includes several Supreme Court decisions, the most famous of which is Chicago Motor Coach versus Chicago. And the conclusion of that trial was the right of the citizen to travel upon the public highways and to transport his property thereon by horse-drawn carriage, wagon, or automobile is not a mere privilege which may be permitted or prohibited at will, but a common right which he has under his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Under this constitutional guarantee, one may, therefore, under normal conditions, travel at his inclination along the public highways or in public places, and while conducting himself in an orderly and decent manner, neither interfering nor disturbing another person's rights, he will be protected not only in his person, but in his safe conduct. It's like 5 pages of that kind of stuff. So your friend is absolutely correct. You know, there is no absolute legal requirement. They have tricked you into thinking that you're engaged in commerce.
And use the fear of fining and potentially suspension and jail time and the loss of that so-called privilege if you don't obey. And see, and it's just wild how they trick into that. But again, you can feel a tremendous feeling of empowerment beginning to occur when you are prepared, when you learn, things like that. It's funny when you were bringing up the Chicago Buggy Corporation against Chicago itself. I was reminded of the movie Good Will Hunting, where there's a scene in the beginning where he's in court and the judge is saying, and I noticed that in this stealing of a car that you cited, the 1800 rights to horse and carriage, in which they overturned that, and you got off scot-free and all these things. Like, this guy really knew when he would go into court exactly how the law worked and how it was processed and knew how to use it, yet he never, went to law school. He just had that brainiac power to do that. And it's funny to realize that sometimes as you're out there seeing and coming to understand and know this, that truth becomes really stranger than fiction. What has been your experience with something like that?
Well, I've traveled without a driver's license for many, many years. Needless to say, I have been pulled over several times, and on at least one occasion went to a trial court. I demanded a trial, which is unusual for a driving thing. It's much easier to pay the fine. You get pulled over, write a check, and it all goes away. Taking time off from work and preparing your paperwork, that's much more, time consuming. Anyway, I went to court, I made some arguments, and suddenly the prosecutor went up and asked the judge if we could, file a motion to dismiss, which we did. We dismissed the case, and the judge is now talking to the jury. And he says, I really want to apologize. We've kept you here all day. We've, filtered you down to a handful of people. But now we're not going to need you because the case is dismissed. And then the judge looked directly at me, and he said, and I'm really disappointed because I was really looking forward to your arguments.
Wow.
the judge wanted to hear.
I want to see a citizen that actually entertains me because I want to dismiss him just because he has the courage and the intelligence to figure this whole thing out, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's another one. It's actually my favorite.
It's like my cousin Vinny. You know, the judge is just sitting there, and he's just watching me argue with it because the DA knew he was wrong, you know. And then he takes him out to lunch later on and says, you know, I think you ought to go into law. Those kinds of things can actually occur, can't they?
Well, yeah, and most people don't follow logic, so it's easy to get away with anything in court. But my favorite court decision is People versus Battle. It says persons faced with an unconstitutional licensing law which purports to require a license as a prerequisite to exercise a right may ignore the law and engage with impunity in exercise of such right.
Wow.
If it's unconstitutional, it was never a law in the first place. Just ignore it.
Now, I know that when it comes to fear, certainly a lot of people are feeling it this year, especially with this COVID-19, this idea of fast-tracking a virus vaccine, and the looming question as to whether this thing will be required or mandated, much as the masks have sort of been, and the idea, well, what are the repercussions? Should I not take it? Now, it's an easy one to actually take a look at as far as the fear of, well, what if you go to work and your boss says to you, well, you know, you can't come to work if you don't take the vaccine, you know, or if you don't take the vaccine when your number's called up, you might end up in a FEMA camp. Well, the bottom line is, from my understanding, and I looked into it a little more, is when it comes to being vaccinated, if there is an alternative way to treat whatever the vaccine was made for, that's safer and it's effective, they can't mandate anything on you.
Well,
but what would you say to people that are facing this potential?
I would tell you that the government cannot mandate anything. They can't mandate it. We, the people, create Congress. We created the government. The government works for us, not the other way around. My first press conference for the presidential campaign, the first question was, Mr. Badnarik, what is your opinion about mandatory vaccinations? And I hadn't become a diplomat yet. I hadn't learned how to answer a question without deliberately pissing people off. And my response was, you bring the syringe, I will bring my 45, and we will see who makes a bigger hole. I own my body. It is my body. It's not in really great shape anymore, but it's still mine. I decide what I eat. I decide what I drink. And I decide whether or not I am going to be vaccinated. And they say, well, Michael, aren't you being like really violent? I go, no, I'm preventing violence. I said, you're trying to attack me with a lethal injection. And they go, well, no, it's not a lethal injection. I go, how do I know that? I'm supposed to roll up my sleeve and let you stick a needle in my arm, and then, as I'm dying on the floor, then I have an opportunity to complain. No, that's insane. You know? And so a lot of people have been concerned about this. The vaccine is supposed to be available shortly after the election. And you're right, the question is whether it's going to be mandatory or just available to anybody who wants it. But, you know, anybody that comes to my door with a syringe is never going home. It's not an option.
You know, and it's back there with the mask mandate and how that all happened, because the Center for Disease Control never mandated that we had to wear masks. They just simply said, hey, we suggest you do that because it could help, but it's not mandatory. But yet the governors of all the states turned that whole thing around and decided, well, we're going to do this instead. And I can't believe some of the things that I'm seeing governors and mayors get away with. And one of the things I know I was talking with my wife about was, I'll bet, you know, what they should do from this point moving forward, anybody that runs in Congress needs to study the Constitution, okay? They need to study it. In other words, for them to be able to qualify to even run for any government office, and I do mean any government office of which you're voted in, that you should pass a test on the Constitution, both written and orally, just like lawyers have to in a bar exam, and you must pass with at least a 90% or better score. And I said, the reason I thought that should be implemented is this. When you get idiots like Mayor Lightfoot, or you get governors like Cuomo or that guy out there, Gavin Newsom in California, that are doing what they're doing, as a group of citizens, hey, you did this, we know what your test score was, that got you into office. We're here now to arrest you as citizens for treason against the people in the United States of America. You're done. There is no recall. Do we vote them out? You're just done. You're fired. Would you think that would be a reasonable solution there?
Well, it's wonderful, but it's bluebirds over the rainbow. Who's going to enforce that?
That's the idea. Is supposed to be
who's
the people.
Who's going to be enforce that?
I gotcha.
So I agree that anybody who runs for office, should know the Constitution, but it's the American people who lack knowledge of the Constitution. The Constitution, it's not the Constitution's job to protect you. It's your job to protect the principles found in the Constitution. And again, if you've never read the Constitution, you would never know if Congress was doing something unconstitutional in the first place. So what we need is we need 320 million Americans to wake the heck up, learn the difference between rights and privileges, which is something you can download from my website at narc.org, and stop being submissive to the government. Whenever I'm approached, my response is, yes, the gun is loaded. Why did you ask?
And I think that really brings us to the final step here, because you can feel the boiling point as people are becoming very tired of all this civil unrest and all this mandating. There's a civil war on the horizon, isn't there?
Yes, unfortunately there is. There are two ways to change a person's attitude. That's intellectual discussion or violence. Stupid people cannot participate in intellectual discussion, so stupid people almost always use violence. And we've got so many stupid people in the United States on both sides that they are, taking to the streets. We call it civil unrest, but it's rioting. And, they don't even know what they are rioting for. And so, yes, the virus is putting pressure on people. There's going to be, we assume that there's going to be an election. I don't know how valid that's going to be, but I'm confident that no matter what the outcome of the election is, that there is going to be increased civil disobedience and civil unrest. And the United States is not going to be a very pleasant place. So if you don't have a store of food, a supply of water, and I tell people they should invest in all the precious metals, gold, silver, and lead. And they go, what's the lead for? I go, to protect the gold and silver.
I guess if you didn't know anything about guns, you wouldn't know what the lead was for, would you? How about getting the lead out of your ass? You might have enough to protect yourself.
And not surprisingly, I have had an increase of interest. I teach people how to shoot. That's available on my website too under services, but I've got about 4 different classes tentatively scheduled right now where all of a sudden people are going, oh, this could get nasty, and they want to know how to defend themselves. So I think it's a little bit late to the party, but better late than never. And if you've gone to a gun store, there's no ammunition. There are no guns available. Everybody's buying them off the shelves. So people are starting to realize that it's not going to be pretty. I can't predict the end result. I just know that it's going to be violent.
Well, there's something for someone to fear, many people to fear, but again, as you said, being prepared for that certainly will alleviate a lot of that, and then actually producing a plan that's viable enough not only for your survival, but actually for continuing and potentially thriving is necessary. But if you don't have those things in place, well, then you'll be like a lot of people just sitting in a hole going, how did I find myself here?
Yeah. Well, there's a joke about the police officer pulls over this little old lady on the highway, and when he pulls her over, there's a 38 on the seat. He says, do you have any other guns? And there's a 9mm in the glove compartment. And he goes, do you have any other guns? And she's got a .45 caliber underneath the seat. And the police officer goes, what are you afraid of? She goes, absolutely nothing.
You know, it reminds me of a funny story. Speaking of bikers, a friend of mine, big, burly, rough-looking guy, and he says, I actually had my attitude changed when it came to road rage. I'm a peaceful person now, and I will tolerate the stupidity of other drivers, and even have gone so far as to educate myself how to anticipate what to do in case there's a stupid driver. And he's a motorcycle rider. And he was out on a highway one day, and apparently this little white beaten down Datsun pickup cut him off in such a way that it almost caused a crash. And this was pre-war rage discipline. And he says, so I'm upset and I'm going to tear this guy a new one, right? So he follows them, and eventually they pull off the highway, head into a parking lot like a Home Depot or something. He says, I got off my bike ready to bust the windshield, drag that guy out of his truck. And as I approached, there was a little Hispanic guy there with a 357 in his lap, and he says, did you have a problem? And he says, no, don't have a problem at all. And you could just see the picture of him with his hands in the air walking back on his bike. And he says, my road rage days were done.
Yeah. Yeah. So
It's funny stuff. You know, it's hard to sometimes talk about this, and when you become aware of the fact of how much you have submitted, how much you've kind of let your rights be eroded away, but that doesn't mean it's lost. It means that, well, now you're aware of it, so what are you going to do next? Secret to Sovereignty is certainly a good book to pick up because you're talking about the mindset mostly of what it takes to have sovereignty. And then you have your other books, Good to Be King, which talks a lot about the U.S. Constitution and our rights there. Is there also a website our listeners can go to find out more about your work? And for those who might want to, I don't know, take up some gun training.
My website is very easy. It is badnarik.org, BADNARIK. I can teach you anything you want to know, not just the Constitution, but I recommend that you start with Rights versus Privileges. That's chapter 2 of my first book. I recommend that you read The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And if you have any questions, I do 15-minute consultation on Zoom. So you can go to my website and sign up, and we can talk face-to-face over the computer. And, you can ask me any question. Don't ask me any questions you don't want the answers to.
Those are the ones you should ask the most.
Yeah.
Get it out of the way.
Yeah, it's like Jack Nicholson again. You can't handle the truth. But I think people are starting to wake up. They're shedding their complacency, and they're realizing that, the government's not going to take care of me. I'm going to have to do this myself. And that's a little bit of maturity. As we grow up, we realize that our mom and dad is not going to be there to take care of us. We're going to need to pay our own rent, find our own food, and, provide our own protection. But you have to understand the principles in the Constitution if you want a civil society. And if there are groups, I can do my civil society presentation via Zoom. It takes about an hour to 90 minutes, depending. And it makes it so simple that it is unlikely that you will not be able to understand the flow of political power.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for being on the program today to talk about your book and, the experiences, of course, and as well as the education that people really need to have, especially in these uncertain times, to know where you stand, who you are, what your rights are, and how to move forward to be sure that you feel the liberation that that does eventually bring to you, if not immediately, down long term, because you find you're empowered with strength of mind, you're empowered with strength of spirit, you certainly will have your heart. Boom, you just move forward and you teach others to do the same thing, and that's a very neat place for a person to be.
Well, I try. My health is not as good as it used to be, so I don't know how many more years I have left, but if people want to take advantage of my education, they should call me as soon as possible.
Well, right on. Well, Michael, thank you for being on the program today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me back.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, wherever you are is where you should be. Have a great day.